Wamanjika. Welcome, friends, to our series from Mark's Gospel as we follow Jesus on the road with his disciples. My name is Stephen Barro from the Melbourne chapter of God Squad, and I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri country in Australia. And I pay my respects to our Indigenous elders, past and present, and thank our Creator for their care of this land. We've been on this journey for a long time now, and we're getting to the pointy end of the journey. Today is part 66, and we were looking at Mark chapter 14, verses 66 to 72, where Peter denies Jesus 3 times. We're actually deep in Holy Week now, in Mark's Gospel, and today as you watch this, we're entering into the same period, with tomorrow actually being Holy Thursday. Over the past few weeks, we've seen from my brothers the story of betrayal and arrest, and last week the beginning of the trial process of Jesus. We've been reminded about the brutality and intimidation of the arrest and the court process. And as someone who's been arrested myself and faced court, I know how powerless and intimidating this can be. Dave reminded us about this last week, that Jesus is in the upper courtyard in the home of the high priest. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, are trying to find something to charge Jesus with. And they finally settle on blasphemy, and then they begin to beat Jesus. So today's story goes on from that and is parallel to last week's story. Today's story is recorded in all 4 Gospels. And we get some further context from John's Gospel, when we are told that both Peter and John followed Jesus at a distance with his captors following his arrest, both of them having deserted Jesus. John seems to know one of the high priests, and so follows the guards into a deeper courtyard to watch proceedings. Peter does not follow John and stays in the lower courtyard, warming himself by the fire. He's surrounded by servants and guards who grow increasingly suspicious of his presence and his role in what's about to happen. So let's read the story in Mark chapter 14, verse 66. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You were with that Nazarene Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and he went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near to Peter said, "Surely you're one of them, for you're a Galilean." He began to call down curses and swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately, the rooster crowed the 2nd time. Then Peter remembered the words that Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Here we have a very human story of Peter, and it shows us his highs and lows. We've already seen this throughout the gospel stories. Peter is one who seems to be closest to Jesus, yet constantly seems to be missing the point. A bit like me, and perhaps a little bit like you. As Jesus stands trial, Peter waits in the shadows. Whereas just hours earlier, he had pledged loyalty to Jesus, even unto death. On the way to Mount Olives, Peter was brash enough to state that even if all the other disciples fall away, he would never betray Jesus. In the Garden of Gethsemane, we see that he drew his sword to protect Jesus. Now he has the option of joining John and witnessing what's happening to Jesus, but he can't. He's too afraid. And we see him, under the pressure of a few pointed questions, deny Jesus not once, but 3 times. His denials grow stronger with each accusation, ending with swearing and cursing. "I don't know this man you're talking about." Then the rooster crows, and suddenly everything comes crashing down. Peter remembers Jesus' words, and he breaks down and weeps. Here we have a deeply human moment, one that reminds us how fear can overpower even the strongest of intentions. Peter's failure is not born out of hate or rejection, but out of fear and weakness. It's a very human story of Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples and mates, who out of self-preservation and fear denies him. A good question to ask ourselves is what we would have done, what I would have done in a similar situation. When have we denied our faith? When have we denied Jesus? In fact, when have we denied those closest to us? It's easy for us, as we read this today, to look down at Peter in hindsight. We've been reminded over the past 2 weeks by Buckshot and Dave, particularly, of the brutality of the oppressors, of what happens and what happened with Jesus once he was arrested. Remember, it was the Jewish religious leaders who wanted Jesus dead, and they had to collaborate with the Romans, the foreign occupiers of Palestine, to make it happen. We'll see this play out over the next few weeks. Every Jew lived under the Roman occupation and the constant fear of violence and ultimate death. For the locals, the cross was a brutal reminder of what happens to people who stand up against the Romans, those who rock the boat. In fact, it's been estimated by historians that throughout the whole Roman reign, they executed on the cross over 2 million people throughout the empire. It was a brutal symbol of power and control. And of course, for us, has a very, very different meaning for us today as we wear sanitized crosses around our necks and display them in our churches. But for first century Jews, they had a very different meaning. And of course, we know this constant occupation and harassment and violence eventually led to the Jewish revolt in 66 and 70. And this had catastrophic consequences for the Jewish people, including widespread destruction, mass slaughter, enslavement, exile, and the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, which Jesus had prophesied about earlier. I'd like to suggest that what Jesus and his disciples and Jewish people were facing then was not too different from what we see today, because brutal regimes use fear, violence, and intimidation to subdue any dissenters so they can remain in power. Nazi Germany, we saw that Adolf Hitler and the Gestapo used concentration camps, public executions, and propaganda to keep power. Stalin's Soviet Union used mass surveillance, forced labour camps, and purges and show trials. North Korea, over the last few years, has used absolute state control, secret police, forced labour camps, execution of defectors, and censorship. Pinochet's Chile in the early 70s through to the early 90s used military rule, torture centres, disappearance of political opponents, and censorship. Myanmar, particularly over the last 4 years since the coup, the military generals used brutal crackdowns on protests, arbitrary arrests, killings, and internet blockouts. And Hong Kong, again, especially over the last 5 years, we see mass arrests of protesters, activists and journalists, media suppression, censorship and surveillance. And there are many, many more examples throughout history and today. The modern day example of the cross, the power of the execution to keep people in line. These regimes show how fear is used as a weapon, not just to punish dissenters, it certainly does that, but to prevent them from ever arising. They use all kinds of elaborate systems of surveillance and punishment to make opposition seem even impossible. Yet in each case, we see courageous individuals resist, often at great costs. The Roman Empire at the time of Jesus was no different, and it is any wonder then that Peter reacted the way that he did, out of a sense of fear and self-preservation. And with good reason, for we know Jesus was ultimately executed on a Roman cross to make a political statement, not to upset those in power. We also know that this is not the end of Peter's story, nor of Jesus' story. We know that Jesus had anticipated and even predicted Peter's denial just before Jesus washes his disciples' feet with an act of true servant leadership. We know that after Jesus' execution was the resurrection, the ultimate sign of life out of death and the hope that we have as followers of Jesus. After the resurrection, Jesus appeared many times to his disciples and to others. On one occasion, he asked Jesus 3 times if he loves him, paralleling these denials. When Peter affirms his love, Jesus gives him the charge to care for the believers after he ascends to his Father in heaven. We see that Jesus ultimately restores him with love and grace, and Peter goes on to become the foundational leader of the early church. But we're getting ahead of ourselves now. At this moment in today's story, we have Peter utterly broken at his denial of Jesus. And it's going to get worse for Peter and his mates as they'll shortly witness Jesus tortured and crucified. And we're going to see this over the next few weeks in our Mark series. This is not the way they expected it would end. Yet Jesus had actually given them huge hints along the way of what was to follow, leading to his death and ultimate resurrection. So as we conclude today's reflection and in real time we enter Easter, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, I'm reminded that we often need to sit in the pain and the anguish and the darkness of denial before resurrection comes. I wonder this Easter what pain, denials and anguishes that we would normally want to run away from, that we need to sit in and bring to our Lord today, knowing that as followers of Jesus, we are death and resurrection people. We cannot have one without the other. Peter's story ultimately reminds us that God is not finished with us. Even in our worst failures, his grace meets us in the courtyard, in the weeping, and in the restoration through the resurrection. Amen.